This is a Pete Anderson surfboard. Pete Anderson's a New Zealand shaper who started shaping boards in 1983.
Damn! I'm sorry.
He was working for Saltwater Surfboards in Whangamata. If you've seen my video on that red lightning bolt restoration, you'll know a little bit about saltwater surfboards. And he was also shaping under the Town & Country label as well, until about 1992, and then Pete went out and started his own label, which is Anderson Surfboards, which is what we're looking at here. Pete still makes boards to this day. He's probably one of our biggest, if not the biggest, surfboard producers in the country. It's always a pleasure to get one of his boards in, always a pleasure to get any Kiwi shapers boards in, but Pete has been doing it for a long time, so it's always nice to see what he's up to all this time later. A funny story about Pete Anderson, which he actually doesn't even know about, I've never told him, but on the side, Pete also acts as kind of a small kind distributor for FCS fin boxes, and in particular, boxes that I've bought from him in the past have been the FCS Fusion boxes. So whenever I run out of Fusion boxes, I always send Pete an email and see if I can grab some from him, because that way I don't have to wait for them to come from the actual FCS distributor all the way from Australia. So it can be a good way to get those boxes in quickly if I've got a job in that needs them and I've just realised that I've run out. This situation has occurred maybe 10 times in the past. I've probably done roughly 10 orders through Pete Anderson for Fusion boxes or maybe some other FCS boxes. And every single time I've made an order, I always just Google Anderson Surfboards, find the website, find the contact, and email that contact. And I would say a good 8 out of 10 times that I've made that order, I've actually emailed the wrong people. It turns out there's also an Anderson Surfboards in Hermosa Beach, California. So I have sent Anderson Surfboards in California probably 8 emails, all separately asking if I can buy some more Fusion fin boxes. I've never received a reply from them ever, but somewhere in their inbox is a bunch of requests from me. So if Anderson Surfboards in California happen to be watching this, I hope now you understand what's going on. I'm actually meaning to contact Pete Anderson in New Zealand. I can't promise you guys that this will never happen again, but I will try my best to email Pete Anderson instead of Anderson Surfboards from now on. So we should probably talk about the surfboard and the repair that is underway at the moment. So first steps, of course, the repair is really close to the tail pad, so that all had to be cut away, scraped away, and use a degreaser to get rid of any adhesive. I then sanded the whole area because I really don't want any adhesive left behind and getting under my resin, so everything's been sanded until 120, or with 120 I should say, and now we're just slowly cutting away our broken area into a neat shape that we're going to be able to insert a new piece of foam into. And with a repair this size, we're going to go with an offcut of PU foam from an old board, not the foam I tend to use more often, which is that 2-part pour foam. And before we start mucking around with gluing foam blocks in and all the rest, we're just going to take a template tracing of the outline of the section of the tail that is still left on the board, because then we'll be able to cut and make this template while our foam block resin is curing. The tricky thing about this particular repair was, as you saw earlier, the leash plug was left in the board, and I really didn't want to add that expense for the customer and add that extra work for myself to remove that leash plug and install a new one. But seeing as the structural integrity of the leash plug was possibly compromised, when I beveled the corner of the foam to meet the leash plug, I decided to tie it to the fiberglass that sits on the underneath of the board, much the same as if I were installing an FCS1 plug. So you can see that bevel I'm cutting goes all the way down that corner, and then we'll fill the excess with resin, which will tie into the fiberglass in the channels of this board. I hope that makes sense, but we will see it happen a little bit later down the track. But for now, we're going to kind of tape our foam block in place and then get everything coated with our, this is just a poly resin with a micro balloon mix in it. Mix relatively thick enough to stay in place and not drip, but thin enough to kind of spread when everything's mushed together. And then once all that resin's in place, because our foam block is already taped on the underside, we just have to kind of fold that tape over and that'll tie everything into place. When doing a step like this, don't be afraid to get your body weight into it. I'm pushing that foam block with my stomach as hard as I can into the board, so everything's nice and tight. I don't want any gaps left where the join, or where the foam meets the board. I want that all tight and filled. So just pushing it with all of my body weight, getting my tape into the right place, and don't be afraid to use excess masking tape if you need it to make it tighter, to tweak it, adjust its position. More tape, more better. So while we're waiting for that to cure, now that we've got our template traced out, I can spend the time cutting it out. For small templates like this, I prefer to use my mate Stan Lee. It just creates a straighter edge. You don't have to square the edge of the template up after. It's much easier to get a nice neat cut. On a bigger template, you'd probably use the jigsaw, but for something small like that, Stan Lee does the trick. And just like that, hey presto, our block is glued into place, resin cured, so we're good to pull that tape off and start shaping this thing down. So the first step is just to get a rough thickness. I do sometimes use the planer for this, especially with noses where there's rocker and stuff to play with, but in this case I opted to use the sander because my sander is attached to a vacuum which sucks up the dust, and so it just makes for neater work if I use the sander and the vacuum combined. I am starting to get some comments from people stating that I should be wearing a mask every time I sand and all the rest. I would like to point out that when I'm sanding here, you can see next to no dust because my vacuum setup is very good and very expensive, and my sander is very good and very expensive. On average each day I'm sanding boards for 6 to 8 hours. That's like the vast majority of my job is sanding. So I put a lot of money into a setup that creates very little dust, so I don't have to wear a mask constantly. Believe it or not, there are downsides to covering your face and nose for 8 hours a day with a sealed respirator. This can vary from cracked lips, major skin problems around your face, ingrown hairs from your beard. You have to maintain that beard all the time. It just isn't very practical to wear a respirator for that amount of time every single day. It's also very uncomfortable, sweaty and gross, and my girlfriend would probably never kiss me again if I wore a respirator 8 hours a day. So that's the backstory behind that. So with our thickness pretty good to go and our channels roughed in, we're able to cut out the outline. And then, although I did it with the Stan Lee and the edges are pretty square, we still need to make sure they're truly square to get the best rails that we can possibly get here. Most of our rail work is going to be on the deck side anyway, because we're at the tail end. We're going to be left with a hard edge on this tail anyhow. So we're going to flip the board over and just kind of roughly marking where Pete has put his bevel in originally on this board. We're going to try and copy it by eye and with the sanding block and make that same bevel as best as we can. While I'm working on boards like this, I'm always thinking about how it's going to look visually with the outcome. And in this particular board, although I did do this job quite a while ago, I've been sitting on the footage a long time, but you can see there's rail savers, little carbon strips up the rail. So my plan here was to try and hide the join where my foam meets the original board on the deck side by painting one of those rail savers over the join, and that would disguise it. Suffice to say, I blew that, which we'll see down the track, but yeah, that was kind of what I was thinking at this point was going to happen. So that is pretty much all of the shaping taken care of. We do have some defects in our foam. So on our furthest right channel here, I gouged the foam with my block corner, so that's a pain in the ass. So what we're going to use is the spackle. So we have used spackle in these videos before with a Takeda Customs. It was a pretty nasty nose snap that I repaired. So spackle is a water-based compound used for fixing holes in your drywall. Funnily, I was an interior plasterer for years and I had never even heard of spackle before, and then once I went into the surfboard making or fixing part of the world, spackle came up almost immediately as a talking point. Being a water-based product, it's not ideal to use for surfboards, so I really reserve it for really small areas like this, tiny little pinholes and gouges, but it's not something you want to be laying on super thick and super heavy. This is our hole that leads to the bottom of the leash plug, so the plan is this resin will tie to the leash plug, and then when I glass the board, the leash plug will be tied to the fiberglass on the underside of the board, so hopefully strengthening it enough to last for a long time. The board hasn't come back and this job is at least a year old, so I'm supposing it worked. The spackle really needs to be left until the next day before sanding, just letting all that moisture evaporate out of it, but the benefit of spackle is it sands at about the same rate as foam does. So as I'm sanding here, I'm not taking out huge amounts of foam while hardly any spackle at all. If I used a product like resin with micro balloons or Q-Cell, that would be a big problem. So here's where things start to go a little bit wayward with this job, and that's not uncommon. Quite often you have a plan in your head of how things are going to look and they don't turn out the way you initially thought they would in the beginning. So like I said, my plan on the deck side here was to paint a rail saver that would hide the join where my foam meets the board, but I stupidly masked all the way into the stringer, which none of the rail savers do. So it looked really unnatural and I just wasn't focused, I guess. Seeing as I had painted this directly to foam, there wasn't really a lot I could do about it, because if I tried to sand the paint away, I would end up sanding the foam away, and that is shaped to perfection, so we don't want to touch that. So the only real choice at this point is just to keep moving on, start glassing it, and we will deal with the aesthetics towards the end. Now the glassing at this stage of the job isn't a structural thing, although it's going to add some structural integrity, but I'm pretty sure I'm using a 2-ounce fiberglass cloth here, and the only real purpose of laminating here is to give me an area I can sand and paint and muck around with without fear of affecting the foam that I've shaped to fit in there. So I'm just kind of creating a shell so that at least my foam is protected and I don't have to worry about the shape of it and damaging it from here on out. If you ever go to Board Porn's Instagram and you find a photo of a brand new board with crazy channel work in it, guarantee there will always be a comment, at least one in the comments section, stating, "I wouldn't want to glass that," or "I wouldn't want to sand that." And those people leaving those comments are not wrong. Channels are a pain in the ass to glass, and they can be a pain in the ass to sand too. Having that high and sharp edge on each channel is a prone place for air bubbles and sanding through. So this tail repair, it got a little tricky from this point onwards. All doable, but it just takes a little bit of extra care than your average tail. So once our cloth and our sanding resin is applied, we're good to sand it all to shape, and now I can continue working on this board without having to babysit that exposed foam. Everything's solid and protected, so we're good to go. This is where we start to get into a little bit of detail when it comes to painting. So generally, like I've done here, with repairs on poly boards, I like to keep all of my paint underneath fiberglass cloth. It just means that paint will never scratch, it'll never chip and flake away, it's in there nice and solid, and it blends into the board much better as well. So on the top side of the board here, we're going to do exactly that. This paint area is so small that I can comfortably add that amount of glass to the deck to cover all of that paint, and I know my paint is protected. That's going to be slightly different on the underside with what we're going to do. So initially the plan was to do the same paint job top and bottom, same colour, blended into the original board, glass over it. On the deck side here I added a black pinstripe just to kind of make it all seem a bit more symmetrical, because white boards are almost impossible to match. And on the tail side here I painted it well enough that the repaired area blended into the board pretty well, and the plan was to just glass over it normally and leave it at that. While 99% of my repairs go according to plan for the most part, and no real dramas, I've been using these materials long enough to know what works and what doesn't, this board was kind of cursed from the beginning. So take note on the length of the cloth I'm putting here. It's not a huge patch, it's not going to add a ton of weight or weird flex or anything to the board. We haven't cut a straight line rail to rail, it's tapered off so we're not creating a snapping point, and we laminate it as per usual, getting our fingers into those channels to make sure everything's laminated down nice and tight. And right there by the tip of the tail you'll start to see this weird red spot emerge. I'm not 100% sure what that is or why it happened. It's actually never happened to me before and it hasn't happened since, but man, that thing was killing me and there was no way that I could leave it looking like that. Small Kind Ding Repairs has always run under the motto of what I like to call the Instagram standard. If you're a fellow ding repairer, or you once were a ding repairer, or if you're thinking of becoming a ding repairer, you are bound to run into customers who bring you boards and they say something along the lines of, "It doesn't have to look pretty, I just want it to be functional." While I don't tint and paint and perfectly colour match all of the repairs that I do, at the very least when repairs leave my shop, they always look neat, tidy and respectable. There is a standard to my work, and that standard is the Instagram standard. The basic premise for the standard is if the work doesn't look good enough, nice enough to take a photo and post it on Instagram, then it's not good enough or nice enough to leave my workshop. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm even going to take a photo of it and upload it to Instagram. But if I wanted to take a photo of it and upload it to Instagram, it has to look the part. So for customers who come to me and say, "It doesn't have to look pretty, I just want it to be watertight," my answer to them is the jobs will always be to a high standard. Not necessarily perfectly colour matched or anything like that, but you are going to pay slightly more with me because I'm not going to leave it looking like a dog's breakfast, essentially. I'll always try and make a repair as cheap and affordable as I possibly can for the customer, but ultimately it's my name attached to this work. And when this customer is down at the beach talking to their mates about their board, and they say, "Oh, who did that repair for you?" and they say, "The local guy at Small Kind Ding Repairs, that handsome fella," my name is essentially tied to that work, and if the repair looks bad or looks dodgy, then those 2 or 3 friends looking at the repair might hesitate to bring their board to me the next time they ding their board. I understand why customers might ask for a repair that doesn't look good but just holds the water out to save some money, but I've never been willing to put my name to that kind of work, so I'm happy to pass them on to another repairer who will happily do that. And I don't fault them for it either. If they can do a quick $50 repair that doesn't look good, then that's fine, good for them, but I don't want my name attached to that kind of work. With all that said though, it does bite me back every now and then, and this job was a classic example of that. I really wasn't happy with the way this job looked aesthetically. Structurally, it was sound, I'm sure, but aesthetically, I just didn't like it. It didn't meet that Instagram standard. The red spots in the lamination I didn't like. The white I couldn't quite get to blend in right on the underside. It was, just too clean. And then there were some areas on the tops of the channels, the sharp edge of the channel, where the paint had kind of moved away when I laminated, and that exposed some foam, so it looked kind of motley and uneven. It just yeah, I didn't like it at all. So I wasn't willing to put the job out, essentially. So I rang the customer and told him what was going on and said I would like to do a spray job on your board. I won't charge you extra for this paint job because it's of my own fault, but I can't give you the board back looking how it's looking currently. And so this is what we came up with together. It would have been really easy for me to just polish this board up, give it back to the customer as it was, and take the money and run, essentially. But to me, there's no point in having a standard if you're not going to hold yourself to it, and this board just didn't meet the standard. So this paint job was a necessary cost for me. I had to cover the cost of the paint and the time to get it all masked up and looking good, but ultimately in the end it was worth it, and I held my standard. So yeah, definitely worth it in the end. The downside I will say to this is the paint on the underside in the channels is on top of the fiberglass, so it won't last as long as the paint on the deck side, which is underneath the fiberglass. But shy of laminating a full third of the board and adding a lot more material, this really was just the only option that I could come up with. So there you go, not everything goes perfectly all the time here at Small Kind Ding Repairs, but if you make a mistake, you've got to be willing to repair it, even if that's at your own time and cost. And it turns out I never even uploaded these photos to Instagram, so that is now done. Check. As always, you guys, I hope you're well. As the cool kids say, don't forget to smash that subscribe button, and any feedback, questions, insults, leave them in the comments down below, and I'll be sure to answer them. Until next time, guys, have a good one. Choo-hoo!